and it's my great pleasure to introduce to you, although many of you know her, of course, Carmen Muñoz, who's Professor of English Linguistics and Applied Linguistics at the University of Barcelona, and where she also heads the GRAL research group, which she's going to tell us a bit more about in a minute. Carmen is very well known worldwide for her work on early instructed learners, and she's directed many very influential research projects. I think the one probably which has really shaped the field and is a crucial project is the Barcelona Age Factor project, which ran over many years and which we're going to hear more about, and which has had a major impact on how we understand the role of age in instructed settings. We will hear more about that shortly. She's also been heavily involved in the ELI project, which is a European-wide project. ELI stands for Early Language Learning in Europe, which again has been quite a major project in the field. Carmen was Vice President of Eurosla and has been on the executive of many associations such as AILA, which is the International Association of Applied Linguistics, and many bodies in Spain as well. So it's really, we're very lucky to have Carmen here with us today, and I welcome you most warmly, and I will hand over to you now for your talk on early foreign language learning, challenges and opportunities. Thank you.
Yeah. Like this?
Yeah.
Hello, good morning everybody. I'm very pleased to be here today on this very special occasion. I'm a bit envious, I must say, in a good sense, right? Because you are launching this center, which I'm sure it's going to have an impact in the field. Yeah? I wish the center a very long and successful life. We don't have a center, that's why I said I'm a bit envious. But we have a group, that's GRAL. GRAL stands for, in Catalan, Grup de Recerca en Adquisició de Llengües, Language Acquisition Research Group. And I just noticed today, while sitting here, being this a year of anniversaries, that it is our 20th anniversary, and I hadn't realized. So when I go back home, we are going to celebrate. So we started in 1995 with the BAF project. That was our first major project. And I will be telling you about it, but also more generally about school learners. This is one of the lines of the group, of the research group, and maybe one asks why our interest in school learners. For different reasons, in the last years I have done little surveys on what journals publish on young learners, and it is surprisingly low, right? If you look, for example, language awareness, only 9 out of the 82 papers in the last 6 years, one of them is mine, so it doesn't count. In the Modern Language Journal, also recently, we conducted with my colleague Laura Collins a survey of classroom studies, and since 2000 to 2014, and again only in 7 out of 89 learners were primary school students. And yet, since the mid-90s, in many countries of Europe and now all over the world, we see these starting earlier of foreign language learning. So it is very surprising that we don't have more research on those young learners from an SLA perspective, right? We may have things about teaching and teaching experiences, but not much about how they learn foreign language. Lourdes Ortega, 10 years ago already, for a different concern of hers, somehow had a critical view of instructed SLA research that is conducted in the US, but everywhere else, usually involving adult learners. So this has a methodological problem, epistemological problem, right? Because we may generalize from these adult learners. And also from an ethical point of view, as she says, if we don't study certain populations, we cannot serve them either. So, early foreign language learning, this is my plan for today. I'll talk of foreign language learning in primary school, focusing mainly on age and time, drawing on my research and the research of my group. And then I'll also share with you what learners have to say about primary school experience once they have gone to secondary school, right? So that'll be voices from learners and teachers on thinking on primary. And here I'll talk of what they learn, how they learn, challenges for them to learn, and their motivation. And I'll finish with looking ahead for current implementations in the field. So, foreign language, right? We're talking here foreign language. It's an additional language that is learned after one or more languages have been learned in the family, and that distinguishes it from bilingualism. It is mediated by instruction and literacy, which is also different from child language acquisition, and exposure of typical foreign language learning is limited to the classroom, which distinguishes it from second language learning, which is not limited to the classroom. Now, when foreign language is early, it's not learned in the family, instruction, teachers are told not to use explicit teaching. Young children should learn in a more communicative way, holistic way, etc. Not very clear whether teachers really do not try to teach explicitly at this stage, it varies. And of course, with young learners, literacy is very limited in the first language. Exposure is limited to the classroom, again in the typical, right? And so far, when I conclude the talk, I think looking to the future, we'll see that this may change, or it's changing. And as I said before, it is an area that is comparatively unexplored. What does research tell us about early foreign language learning, instructed foreign language learning? There are many methodological difficulties. I'm not going to be talking about them today, but assessing young learners is very difficult, right? And the issue of whether you assess for learning or of learning, it's even more crucial. When we look at language outcomes, and now in contrast with immersion naturalistic language learning, we see that the rate of learning is slower, but slower than second language. And we also find that because of input limitations in school contexts, these kids do not achieve near native-like pronunciation and intonation, which is one of the advantages of learning a language at an early age. And this is what happens with second language learning, right, when in an immersion situation. The two large surveys on foreign languages in elementary schools with a European scope concluded that the main gains were attitudinal, right, which excludes linguistic. So there is this idea and that young learners like learning foreign languages, and then this is positive for their learning. There are other benefits, and one of them is that if you begin early, then they have more time for learning, which is supposed to set the stage for advanced levels of proficiency, and I'll talk about this later too. There are other non-language, not immediately language-related benefits, more of an educational type, such as intercultural awareness, the acquisition of intercultural awareness, and an openness to people who speak other languages and cultures, which is it's the sort of skills we want for our children in our global world. Okay, so let me begin with the early language learning antecedents and tell you about the research we conducted in BAF. If we go out in the street and we ask people, but also researchers, right, about foreign language learning or second language learning, everybody will say that the earlier the better. And this has a theoretical base on the critical period hypothesis, which was formulated for first language acquisition and which tells us about this, if you want, window of opportunity that finishes at puberty to learn an additional language. If you don't begin, that was the idea, if you don't begin learning the language before puberty, then you are never going to be successful in learning the language. You're not going to reach native-like levels of proficiency, etc. Now, this hypothesis of a critical period was also extended to second language learning, and in a way, the research that was done in the area, if I may say, seemed a bit biologically determined, predetermined, right? Things like context of learning was not looked at, motivation, emotion, identities of learners did not seem to matter much because age was the crucial factor, was the only explanatory factor for second language learning. The target for that type of research was for the model was the idealized native speaker, which is usually a monolingual native speaker, and the type of learners that were studied were learners learning the language usually in an immigration situation, right? So it was naturalistic. Now, what happened, and that was when we were motivated to do our own research in schools, was that these findings, and I'll tell you now more about the findings, were generalized to school learners, right? So it was expected that if you learned a foreign language in the school before puberty, you would reach native-like intonation, pronunciation, things like that. I'm exaggerating. Yeah. So these are the two age-related advantages that research conducted up till now have shown. Research in naturalistic settings concerning rate of learning has shown that in the short term, that is after a few months of arriving in the country, or even a few years, as many as 2 years, there is an advantage for late starters, right? So if we think of a family with very young kids, adolescents, young adults, etc., the very young adults, the adolescents will have better results in tests, etc., of language than the younger, than children. But this is a short-lived advantage because when you come back and examine the language development after a few years, you find that those who were younger when they started learning the language, when they were immersed in the language, have outpaced them, and now they outperform them, right? So they are said to have a long-term advantage. Their ultimate attainment is higher, and they have more probabilities of reaching native likeness. So those are the two robust findings from naturalistic settings. When we started the BAF project in instructed settings, we had these two questions at the beginning. What happens in the short term? What happens in the long term? So this is cutting a very long story short because it was like many years and a longitudinal study of 9 years, where we had groups of learners that began at different ages, AO standing for age of onset. So we had a large group beginning at eight, and that was like the new curriculum when the government in our country decided to lower the starting age. 11, which was the former curriculum, 14, and then young adults, right? Older than 18. And we tested them after 200 hours of instruction, after 416, and after 726. Right? So we control for the time, we control for classes. and we excluded extracurricular input, etc. We tried to really look on comparing this and controlling them. So what we found, summarizing, late starters did always better than early starters at the 3 points. So with the same amount of instruction hours, we could conclude, we could see that late starters are faster and more efficient learners. Yeah? And we saw larger gaps, particularly with those tests that were more cognitively demanding. So that was explained because older learners were more cognitively mature. Our interpretation of the findings were that early starters are better at implicit learning, as the Kais already in 2000 also wrote about. They are better at implicit learning, but implicit learning requires massive exposure to the target language, which is what happens in a naturalistic situation. Whereas later starters are better at explicit learning because they are more cognitively mature, and explicit learning is favored in classrooms. And here I'm talking again of typical classrooms, right? Public schools, not ideal, excellent projects of language teaching, but what happens usually. So our interpretation was that if those early starters had not had this massive exposure to the language, they could never overcome later starters because the advantage they were deprived of the advantage they had. Around the same years, there was another research project in the Basque Country where they found exactly the same findings. And since then, we've seen research going on in different parts of the world, also in England, by Florence Miles and colleagues, but also in the European school system or in Canada, where you have more intensive language learning. But when you are able to also control for the time, you find different similar results. We also have not just behavioral, but also brain-based evidence. We have work going on in Switzerland, the Netherlands, etc. So this answered the first question, which concerned short term. We've seen that in an instructed setting, late starters are more efficient learners. But we could not really claim that we had investigated the long term. We tried, right? Because that was the 726 hours was like the maximum they had at school then. So from an ecological perspective, if you want, that was really long term. And that may be the end for many learners of a foreign language who don't continue learning the language after school. But it's not really long term if we look at this limited number of hours, 726. So the next question we had to answer was, what happens in a longer term? Do we see early starters catching up and outperforming late starters? Of course, we know they are not going to be native-like, right? In instructed setting, this is only natural. So we started the second phase of our research with two predictions. The one that was in the field, which was that young learners just need more time to catch up. So if you come back and analyze them and compare them after a longer number of hours and years, you'll find that they have caught up with later starters. Or our guess, which was that in the end, there would be no long-term advantages because these early starters had been deprived of the implicit learning opportunities at the time when they could have benefited from them. So that was the prediction we had, right? If they do not benefit, they will not have an advantage in the end. And the advantage that we saw from the old learners will also disappear because when we compare them 10 years later, then there won't be differences in terms of cognitive development, right? So there is no reason why age should have an influence in the end. So this is the first of the studies. We looked at learners who had been studying English in our context, the foreign language, for more than 10 years, and they had on average 13 years, almost 14 years of English, more than 2,000 hours. Some of them had stayed abroad as well. And so we again looked at we used some proficiency measures and controlled for age and time and input. And we found that, as we had predicted, the earlier starters did not have a significant, they didn't have higher scores than the later starters. But in contrast, when we looked at time and at input measures that we had taken from our conversations with them and a very long questionnaire, we found that there were significant correlations. So although there was no correlation, there was no effect for when they had started, if it was at the age of 6 or at the age of 9 or at the age of 10, we didn't have very old starters, right? Because we didn't want to have people older than 30. We didn't want aging effects to be interfering with what we were looking at. So what we saw was that whereas age was not a crucial or an explanatory factor, the type and amount of input and contact with the language that these learners had had mattered and had significant effects. So we had a general proficiency test, a receptive vocabulary test, and phonetic perception. And as you can see, we had as many as 15 measures, and there were 6 measures that were significant. So you see hours that they had spent abroad. These are young adults, right? So some of them have already been in an English-speaking country. The frequency of current contact with the language, the years of instruction, hours of curricula, etc. Right? And you see the red arrow, meaning that with phonetic perception, there was only one measure that had significant association, and that was frequency of current contact. Again, we are now seeing more long-term evidence. There was this Larson-Hall study in 2008 where she didn't find that the earlier starters did better at morphology or morphosyntactic development, but she found an advantage in L2 speech perception only in an interval of time. But since then, we've had work done in Japan, in Saudi Arabia, in Taiwan, and in Switzerland, also looking at the long term and finding, again, no significant effects of a starting age. For our own research, we thought it would also be interesting to look not just at proficiency measures, but at oral performance, because one may think, or one may claim that if you've done some more important implicit learning when you were a child, this would show better in an online task than an offline task. So we looked at data from oral performance, which was a retelling of an extract of a movie of Charles Chaplin. And again, these were similar characteristics as before. They had had 13, 14 years of English, and we looked at also the time, input measures, etc. What we found with relation to age was no age effects either. And when we looked at input measures, we found 3 of them who, in a regression analysis, again, were significant, right? So these are the most significant measures we found. And as you can see, oral performance we measured in terms of CAF, complexity, accuracy, and fluency. So we have hours abroad having a big impact, frequency of current contact as well, and also years of instruction, particularly for syntactic complexity, which makes sense. These are all quantitative measures, but we also wanted to see what learners had to say themselves. So we interviewed them, and one of the questions in the interview was whether there had been a turning point in the language learning trajectory, in the language learning history. And very interestingly, we found that out of 181 interviewees, more than 81% of them identified a turning point with an input-intensive context. So here you have two examples of two quotes from two of them. One is a young woman who says that when she felt she started to stack up and really not learning more here in Spain, I moved to Dublin and spent there a couple of months. That was the turning point. This is also another young woman. She comes from Argentina, and she finds that she can have many English-speaking friends in Barcelona, and she also dated a Canadian for a year, right? So she's never been in an English-speaking country, but she identifies this experience of dating the Canadian and talking to her English-speaking friends as a turning point in her learning history, right? Of course, these input opportunities are linked to learners' orientations, right? So there are learners who look for those input opportunities. Okay, so concluding this first part, we see that learning a foreign language in school setting, in a typical school setting, is an opportunity, but it's a challenging opportunity, and that exposure quality and quantity, or exposure quantity and quality are needed. Yeah? Learning a foreign language early means that it is a slow development. And if it is slow, it also means it needs a long time. Yeah? But of course, when we compare the number of hours our learners have with what it takes a child to learn the first language, here I have a figure of 17,000, of course. 1,000 hours of school instruction is nothing compared to 17,000 hours, which of course we cannot give our learners, right? But also what is significant here is that this is by age 4. So these thousands of hours come in a very, very, very intensive format. So is more time for learning, which was one of the advantages, an advantage always? I would argue that it depends on time distribution, probably. And there is this, I think, very significant quote by Patsy Lightbound, where she says that when foreign language learning is treated like the learning of a specialized school subject in short, infrequent sessions, that is Monday from 10 to 10:45 and Thursday from 3 to 3:45, yeah? It can be difficult for students to reactivate the dormant language in between lessons. So even those hours are not really hours of real contact and real processing of the language and real cognitive work with the language, right? So it's I think this partly explains why they are so slow, because of this time distribution in school. Yeah? They come from a monolingual or multilingual, but with other language life, and they come into the room, and now they have, for this very limited time, another language. So we need higher intensity, and we have very interesting experiences going on, like in Quebec in Canada, where they have intensive English, right? Because of language policies, they cannot have immersion in English, but they have intensive programs. And the most successful ones are in grade 6, when they are about 11-year-olds, right? They tried with grade 2, grade 3, grade 6, but now they are trying to generalize it to grade 6. So for a year in grade 6, the students do mostly English. Yeah? That's what they do. They don't do immersion, they don't do content-based, because that's forbidden, so they do English. And they have wonderful results. Another possibility, another opportunity, I thought, was going to be CLIL, right? Content and Language Integrated Learning. And I've written CLIL again with a very little I, because this is the problem, again, I would see, right? What we see, I mean, the idea with CLIL, Content and Language Integrated Learning, was that there was a focus on both content and language. And this is what Canadian experts were telling us at the beginning here to Europeans. Yeah, you are going to be successful because this is better than content-based, because you are integrating language. But what we see now in practice, again, there are exceptions, right? But what I see in my country and in other places is that it has been reduced to content-based. So there is not an integration, there is not a focus on language, and then children are learning more, right, because they have more exposure to the language, but the learning is mostly incidental, right, if there is no focus on language. So there is less, they are gaining less from the experience than they could be gaining. Okay, now I move on to this other research, which started with the ELI project, where we were comparing 7 different countries, and we took a sample of around 150 first-year learners from these 7 countries, and we followed them for 4 years. Then that was a lifelong learning project, a European funded project, and then it finished. So instead of going home, what we did, my colleague Elsa Tregan and myself at the University of Barcelona, was following the same sample for 3 more years. So we did the whole of primary education, 6 years, and then we thought it would be very interesting to see what happened to those children when they arrived in secondary education. So that's the 7-year longitudinal project. We had been, we had this 160 samples from each country, and we had been administering some tests, tasks to the whole class, but also we had focus learners from each class, 6 learners from each class, which we interviewed and also did oral activities. And we were sitting in those classrooms, so we really were familiar with those kids. And as I say, they moved on to secondary education, so they left primary school and moved to a different building, different teachers, different everything. This is not always, the situation is not always the same in all countries. In some countries, primary and secondary are in the same schools, and then there is more continuation. But in many countries, we know that there is this discontinuity between primary and secondary. So some of our results are common to other contexts. So we interviewed them twice, 3 months into secondary and then at the end. And we had, again, long interviews. But I'm just going to be talking about learning, the feelings of learning and motivation. So when we asked them how much you learned in primary school, how was it different from secondary, etc., a few said that they had learned a lot because it was more oral. Yeah? They had more oral activities, etc. Whereas in secondary is more grammar. Yeah, that was the conclusion. But some of the children, and this is worrying, said that they did not learn so much in primary because in primary school we didn't do anything. Well, teachers made us learn 4 or 5 words per topic, and that was it. Now it's more difficult because it's not the typical silly things anymore. And this guy was referring to vocabulary. Here, verbs, conjugations. So you see how they are acquiring these new beliefs, which are, we wouldn't like them to be acquiring them, right? But that's now so they are thinking, we lost our time. Some of them told us, well, we were children, and that's why we didn't have to learn, etc. Now, when we asked the teachers in secondary, again, we had several questions, but these are interesting today. We asked them what the students were like and what they needed when they started secondary school. So we have a long list of adjectives for students. They are spontaneous, they are active, they are happy, they are appreciative, they are very interested. And some negative ones, again, they are slow at doing things, they are childish, unfocused, they need to be given norms because they don't have them. They have limited autonomy and they are very demanding. And what do they need when they come secondary? And we had a couple of teachers who were really very, very clear. She says, what they know sometimes turns against themselves because many things sound familiar. They are led by intuition, what sounds familiar. Another teacher, we have to reorganize what they know. And a third teacher, they can do things, but they don't know why they do them, like the possessives, the S in English. I try to make them see that it is not just adding things, that it is easier if you establish relationships, right? And then we had another question, which was, do you start back from zero? Because that was like something that people would suspect. And they would say, no, not from zero, but almost from zero. So what we see from what the students tell us and what the teachers tell us is that probably there was some implicit learning going on, but there was not enough exposure to consolidate it. Right? There was incidental learning, doing these fun activities, but we didn't see any agenda of the teachers where awareness was promoted. Right? So it was just incidental learning, and there was some explicit instruction. Some teachers were better at that, and some learners were also better at that, but not all of them. So that's the challenge, right? If previous learning in primary school is not recognized by the students or by the teachers, then we are sort of wasting time and opportunities, right? So the lesson here is that foreign language learning needs to continue in a well-articulated sequence. And I would like to insist on this language awareness component, right? We know that noticing is beneficial, it's necessary for instructed learners, but also for young learners. Otherwise, if they are just left to whatever they can learn incidentally or implicitly, then we see that they come to secondary and they have to begin again. So that's again another lesson, I think. We have to foster language and language learning awareness in the primary school classroom. Now, motivation. We asked them about whether they liked English, etc. You'll see several answers. And in general, they said that classes were fun, that they played games and sang songs, and the teachers were nicer. They took more care of us. This is a summary of the 7 years answers. So when you ask young learners if you like English, they tend to say yes. They tend to say yes more in the first years than when they are 11 and 12. You can see that there's some no's here and some so-so. Yeah? But I guess if you ask them whether they learn physical education, that would be 100%. Yeah? Or if you ask them about other school subjects in primary, they tend to please the adult and say yes, yes. So we thought, and that we already implemented it in the ELI project, that we should ask them more indirectly. So we asked them, what are your favorite subjects? And what we saw was that English became the favorite subject around year 3, 4, 5, but then in year 6, which in a way primary teachers in our context are preparing them for secondary, right? So there are fewer games and fewer songs. So that then English disappeared, right? They didn't have fun there, so. But then that made us think. So they liked English because they were having fun. They were liking the activities. If the Spanish or Catalan teachers had used those activities, they would have liked those subjects. We also asked them about those subjects, and they said, oh, English is fun, Catalan and Spanish is the book. Another question in the interview was, what does English language learning mean to you? And here you can see also how, like for example in year 3, they alluded to the characteristics of the lessons. I mean, it wasn't exactly what we were asking, but that was their reflection, right? So what does language learning mean to you? Well, doing songs and games and having fun and etc. Whereas this disappears when they grow by year 7, and they acquire this sense of, okay, we are learning a language. So if the characteristics of the lessons are growing less important with time, so is the motivation also for these classes. And what we find is that what we could consider the motivation, and this is also a global phenomenon, right? People found it when we had primary school students, and now we find it also within primary school students. So as I said, classes are not so much fun now, and motivation that was related to the immediate context declines. Yeah? And here we have a quote from one of the children in first year of secondary, and I think this is also very important. He says, there are people now, other students, who have started French, because that's the second foreign language, which is optional, so they can start it in first year of secondary. They now started French, and they know almost more French than English, that is within the same year. The thing is that sometimes English becomes tedious because you are there all the time. English is slower. Yeah? Of course, learning French is easier than learning English for Spanish Catalan speakers, that's clear, but at the same time, they are already 12-year-olds, they come with all the strategies for learning the language, etc. So there are many reasons to explain this, but this is a common finding, right? That in just 1 year of French, they do so much more, and you know, they feel that in comparison, English is very slow. Yeah? And then they also tell us about the lack of real contact with the language, right? They see that they cannot have people in the family maybe to practice the language, and taking Dornier's terms, looking at lack of out of school or lack of real contact with foreign language, they cannot authenticate their possible foreign language speaking selves. They don't see themselves as English speakers in the future because they are not using the language, really. And again, then bringing in a quote by Lightbound and Spada, already in 1999 too, they reflected that 1 or 2 hours a week, even for 7 or 8 years, will not produce very advanced second language speakers. The drip-feed approach often leads to frustration as learners feel they have been studying 4 years without making much progress. So, in terms of motivation as well, we see how there is a challenge here that teachers, we need to work on learner autonomy and language learning awareness, while attitudes are positive in primary. Yeah? So, in a way, I would argue that we need to transform this motivation that children have in primary from these fun activities to engagement with learning and real use of the language. Right? So that we prepare the ground for when they grow up, and as Rusciotto says, they show willingness to learn associated with internalized personal goals that combine with metacognitive know-how. Okay, and I'm finishing. Some of what I say, I hope, will be obsolete in a few years' time, because I was talking of contexts in which we have very limited input, right, where teaching is reduced to the classroom. Of course, this is also an age phenomenon. This is happening now with older learners, not so much with younger learners, but hopefully it will also arrive to younger learners. Looking ahead to the field, I see that we need to be investigating learning and teaching in what we could call expanded classrooms, expanded in terms of space and time, over the lifespan and across different social contexts, because most of our communities are and are going to be more multilingual and diverse. And of course, there has to be a mutual entailment, cognitive and social. Now, this expanded classroom is a result of globalization, technology, mobility. Now we have many more tools, opportunities for learning the language if there is willingness to learn the language. It has transformed also the classroom, so it has transformed, or it's going to transform also the role of the teacher, right? Not just guiding students for learning out of classroom, but also bringing in what the students, those knowledges that students acquire outside the classroom. so that now we are heading towards this anytime, any place learning that technology affords. And finally, we also see a future of lifelong learning, like I can see in your center. So we need a better understanding of how to help young learners. We see it as a challenging opportunity, and also a better understanding of how to help older adults, but we are going to hear the expert later on. Thank you very much for your attention.